Welcome back, everyone. This video is going to continue talking about Aristotle by looking at his account of eudaimonia and his function argument to support that account. We're going to start by looking at virtuous activity and the role it plays in Aristotle's views. Then we'll look at his appeal to support this argument by thinking of a function as a standard of goodness. We'll cash this out by looking at examples and seeing how those examples form the basis of an analogy for how to investigate the good life. Then that'll lead us into developing Aristotle's function argument, and then we'll use that as a way to revisit some of the reasons Aristotle rejects hedonism, and then I'll leave you with one last final consideration about Aristotle's views. So Aristotle's picture of the good life, or eudaimonia, is captured nicely in this quote from the reading. He says, "The good, for humans, turns out to be an activity of soul in accordance with virtue, and if there's more than one virtue, in accordance with the best and most complete." The idea is that it's the exercise of virtue. It's practicing virtue. It's not merely having virtue. It's actually exercising and practicing that virtue that is necessary for and intrinsically contributes to our flourishing as human beings. Now, this is the conclusion of Aristotle's investigation, so we need to think, how does he support it? And his support is going to come from his attempt to appeal to function as a standard of goodness. So many things in this world seem to have what we can call a function. Consider a couple examples from the natural world. The heart is a natural thing that has a function to pump blood. The eye is a natural thing that has a function to see. There's also examples of human-designed things, like a toaster has a function to make toast. A vehicle has the function of transporting people or things from place to place. A computer has the function to electronically store and retrieve information according to its program. Now, in all of these cases, we can distinguish between good and bad things of those kind. There are good eyes and there's bad eyes. A good eye is one that sees well. A bad eye is one that doesn't see well. So my eyes, even if they're good, they're not perfect. That's why I wear glasses, because my eyes don't perform their function of seeing as well as they could. Similarly, there are good toasters and there's bad toasters. A bad toaster, if it heats up too much, it'll burn the toast. If it heats up too little, it's not going to really crisp the toast, or it's going to take a long time to do so. So when we consider those kind of examples, it seems like each of these is a good thing of its kind to the extent that it performs the function of that kind of thing. Of course, our question isn't the nature of a good eye or bad eye. We want to know the nature of a good human life, the nature of human well-being. But the idea is we can consider this as an analogy. If an eye is good to the extent that it performs the function of an eye, well, human life will be good to the extent that it performs the function of a human life well. But that leads Aristotle to the idea that in order to figure out what the good life is for a human being, we must identify the function of a human life. And Aristotle thinks there needs to be some general function for human beings because individual human beings, like a carpenter or a soldier, have a function. So Aristotle thinks that the function of a thing needs to be something unique to it, to thereby distinguish it from other kinds of things. So a carpenter's function needs to be unique in order to explain how carpenters are different from soldiers. If a carpenter and a soldier had the same function, there'd be no difference between the two. And so similarly, the function of a human life needs to be different from the function of other kinds of lives. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to explain how human life differs from other kinds of life, from plant life, fish life, etc. And so to identify the function of a human life, he thinks we need to identify what's unique to human beings, to our lives. One capacity we have is nutrition. We can feed ourselves, we can get nutrients so as to keep our bodies alive. But that ability, that capacity is not unique to us. Plant life and animal life are also capable of nutrition. They have that same ability. And so nutrition is not the function of a human life. And if that's right, Aristotle thinks that mere survival isn't what makes a human life good. And so the goal of life needs to be not just to live as long as possible. The good life is going to depend upon the quality of that time that we spend living. And the quality of that time is going to be determined by how well we fulfill some other function that human life has. Well, we also have the capacity to perceive and experience the world around us and to intuitively respond to stimuli within our environment. But that's not unique to us. Animals have those same abilities. Animals can experience the world and they can respond to stimuli so as to better navigate the world. So merely having a variety of experiences then wouldn't be what makes a human life good. A good life will at least partly depend not just on having experiences, but on the quality of those experiences. And here's where you might start to think in terms of hedonism. Well, some experiences will give us pleasure and some won't. We have the capacity to experience pleasure. But yet again, Aristotle says, but that's not unique to human beings. It doesn't distinguish human lives from other kind of lives. Animals are also capable of experiencing pleasure. And so, experiencing pleasure is not the function of a human being, and experiencing pleasure is not what makes a human life good. Now, no, that's not to say that experiencing pleasure doesn't play any role in a good life. It's just to say that experiencing pleasure isn't sufficient. It's not enough for a good life for a human being. So now, according to Aristotle, what sets us apart from other animals is that in addition to all those other capacities, we're also capable of being guided by our faculty of reason. We don't have to just act on our instinct. We can think about our intuitive, instinctual reactions to our environment and think about whether or not those things are good or bad, and we can decide to resist those instinctual habits. And so Aristotle concludes that the function of human beings is to reason. And thus, he thinks a human life is good to the extent that it exercises that reason well, it performs that function well. Having a character such that we use our rational abilities well, that we reason well, is what Aristotle considers to be virtue. However, it's important to remember that Aristotle thinks of our exercise of reason more broadly than you might today. Today, you might think someone who reasons well is someone like, all you need to do is be that really great scientist who can sort of consider all these complicated mathematical models and see how well they fit the world in order to describe the world around them. But that's not enough for Aristotle to exercise your reason well. There's much more involved in reasoning well than that. There are those intellectual virtues, and there's ethical character or practical virtues. And all of these are related to using our reason well. The intellectual virtues, these are admirable character traits or excellences in respect to the parts of human beings that have the ability to reason. So this includes things like theoretical wisdom, practical wisdom, scientific wisdom, understanding, intelligence, art, and craft. So notice even here, the intellectual virtues go beyond what we usually think of as reasoning well. Theoretical wisdom and scientific knowledge, this is things like being able to consider complicated arguments, go through the premises, get to the conclusion. But things like practical wisdom and art and craft, these also involve reasoning, but it also involves turning those reasoning into actions. For instance, being good at arts like music, piano. Yes, that might involve some theoretical wisdom, some knowledge of truths about scales, about chords, but that theoretical knowledge is not enough to use that reason well. You need to be able to turn that reason into action. There's a kind of practical wisdom there. There's also another aspect of using your reason well. For Aristotle, these ethical character and practical virtues, these are admirable character traits or excellences in regards to the part of us that even though it can't reason, it can follow reason. It can be guided by reason. So this includes we have emotions, we have desires, we have motivations. My fear, the capacity to fear, it doesn't involve reasoning itself, but my fears can respond, it can be guided by my reason. These virtues will include things like courage, honesty, kindness, generosity, and humility. Now, to give an example, courage involves a lot of emotions, specifically the correct regulation of fear in response to reason. So your fear responding to and following your reason. In order to be courageous, my fear needs to respond appropriately to what my reason tells me. It needs to listen to that reason and feel enough fear, but not too much. And similar things go for honesty, kindness, generosity, and humility. We can take all these ideas and turn them into Aristotle's function argument. The idea is a human life is good to the extent that it performs its function well or excellently, just like an eye is good to the extent that it performs the function of an eye well. But a thing's function is what's peculiar or unique to the kind of thing it is, and our rational capacities is what's peculiar to human life, and so the function of human beings is to reason, and therefore a human life is good to the extent that it exercises its rational capacities well or excellently. And that's just what Aristotle considers a life of virtuous activity. Now, in previous videos, we talked about three competing families of theories about human well-being, the good life, or eudaimonia, as Aristotle calls it. There's hedonistic theories that think of human well-being as the quantity of feelings of happiness that a person experiences throughout their life, and there's nothing else to human well-being. There's desire theories that identify human well-being with a person's desires being satisfied. Then there's these objective list theories that says, no, human well-being has several components, and what makes that part of a good life is that these things are intrinsically good independently of what our preferences or desires are, independently of what we believe about what's important. So where does Aristotle's theory fit? Well, it's clearly not a hedonistic theory, because Aristotle thinks that pleasure is not what's unique to human beings, and so a good life is not just a matter of exercising our ability to get pleasure as best we can. It's also not a desire theory, because Aristotle thinks it's not just a matter of satisfying your desires. Your desires need to be appropriate desires. If you desire the wrong things, then you're not using your reasoning well. His theory is a version of the objective list theory. Exercising virtuous activity, he thinks this is intrinsically good, regardless of whether or not a person desires to be a virtuous person, and regardless of whether or not someone believes that this is good for them. All right, so Aristotle's discussion of function and the good might help us better understand why he thought certain arguments against hedonism were convincing, even though when we looked at them, they initially seemed like pretty bad arguments. So there's that argument from evil pleasures that says hedonism is wrong because pleasure derived from evil isn't as good as pleasure derived from right acts. The problem with this argument was that it seems to be comparing the moral goodness of these pleasures, but hedonism isn't a theory about morality, about what moral goodness is. It's a theory about a person's own self-interest and well-being. But Aristotle's appeal to function in his theory of the good life might improve this argument. And I say might, I'm not sure. But Aristotle's explanation for why evil pleasures are bad is not merely that they are morally bad. Rather, he thinks that a vicious person is exercising their distinctively human faculties poorly. They're not reasoning well since they're mistaken about what is good, what is right or wrong. Or they're mistaken, they don't have knowledge of the importance of morality. And because they're not exercising their reasoning well, they're not living up to their potential as a human being since they're not exercising those capacities that make them human. All right, the swine argument. This argument said that hedonism fails because the best life for animals, such as a pig, wouldn't be an appropriate life for a human to aim for. It seems like we can aim for something better, something more important than just... The objection to this, though, is that but hedonism doesn't say that the life of a pig, the best life for a pig, would be the same as the best life for a human. Since humans, we have the capacity to get pleasure from many different things than animals can. We experience other kinds of pleasures, and so we shouldn't ignore those kinds of pleasures. But Aristotle's appeal to function, yet again, might, maybe not, improve this swine argument. So the hedonist is correct that if we were to live the life of a swine, then we'd miss out on lots of the intellectual pleasures. But Aristotle is suggesting that the best explanation for why we find that comparison demeaning is not that we'd be missing out on certain kinds of pleasure, but rather focusing on pleasure fails to focus on what it is that makes us human. Now, just a final thought to consider. Aristotle's picture of the good life in this function argument might also seem intuitively compelling when we consider a couple examples. So people often talk about cases where you might say someone lets their talents go to waste, or maybe a person with musical capacities may let those go to waste and thereby fail to live up to their potential as a musician. But of course, we're not investigating the nature of good musicianship. We're investigating human well-being. So someone who doesn't live up to their potential as a musician may still live up to their potential as a human being. I mean, there's more to life than just music. Nonetheless, we might consider this as a kind of analogy. So similar to the way that a person with musical capacities fails to exercise those faculties and fails to live up to their potential as a musician, someone who fails to exercise their distinctively human faculties would fail to live up to their full potential as a human being. Of course, surely such persons could live happy lives that are good overall, but we might still think that insofar as they fall short of fulfilling that potential, their lives fall short of being as good for them as they could have been. So even if they are pretty dang good, we still might think that they could have lived a slightly better life. Of course, that's controversial and leads to a number of objections that we'll look at in the next video. But that's all for this video. The next video is going to consider some of those worries for Aristotle's theory of eudaimonia and for this function argument we've looked at. I see you then.